Mr. Seigenthaler, we thank you for the privilege of having this conversation with you today, August 2nd, 2010, at the Seigenthaler Center at Vanderbilt University. Our oral history project was conceived because we believe that while much of history can be preserved and recalled only through writings and archaeological studies, the history of the civil rights movement can be told by the personal recollection of those who participated in the movement, who experienced things themselves that students cannot relive, but can be closer to because of opportunities like this. Your place at the center of the movement, and particularly your experience with the relationship between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of government and their relationship with the Direct Action Campaign, make your recollections particularly meaningful and provide a unique learning opportunity for students that we feel is almost singular in nature, and that's why we appreciate this opportunity so much. Your life as a journalist was actually the first influence on your career in covering the civil rights movement and your later experiences in the movement. Could you share with us the experience of growing up in Nashville and covering the Nashville movement and how that influenced your later experience when you joined the Justice Department under Robert F. Kennedy?
Sure. I am a son of the racist segregated South. I was born and reared in Nashville, Tennessee. And at the time of my childhood, youth, young adulthood, Nashville was as segregated by race as any city in South Africa at the heart of apartheid. Anywhere you were an African American, anywhere you needed to go, wanted to go, hospital, restaurant, hotel, city park, restroom in a public building, water fountain in a public place. You were barred from going because of local ordinance, state statute, federal policy, and a Supreme Court opinion called Plessy versus Ferguson that said separate is constitutionally equal. And so that's the environment in which I was raised. That's what I look back on, as I say, with wonder. You think back on those days and you say, what was wrong with us? What was wrong with our society? What was wrong with our country? What was wrong with our leadership? Abolition was part of this country from the outset. We went through that period when we went out of the way to change the Constitution. But nothing really changed. After that brief period of Reconstruction, we were right back into segregation, and in many ways, lynch law justice was as punitive as slavery, although nothing you can imagine ever could compare with the absolute ownership of a human being, a human life, a human family.
Now, this, of course, must have a powerful influence as you enter journalism and your life evolves into covering the civil rights movement itself here in Nashville.
By the time I had entered into work at the Nashville Tennessean, I had benefited from 2 years in the Air Force. I had benefited from a great deal of reading in school. Pretty early on in high school, I had a math teacher who, for some reason, gave me Jack Cash's book, The Mind of the South. And it had a profound impact on me. It didn't help my math grade, but I realized that Jack Cash was analyzing his own racist upbringing, and it made it possible, I think, for me, for the first time, to look at my own. And once you begin to think, and then once you begin to read, and you read more extensively, and then soon your reading takes you down avenues you didn't know you were going to go. You're reading Connie Cullen and Frank Irby, the novelist, whole range of black writers who's part of the Harlem Renaissance, some of them. Langston Hughes' poetry was powerful, and it begins to make an impact on you. And I think by the time I was out of the military, and this would have been before President Truman desegregated the military, I understood that there was something wrong. I was in the control tower in MacDill Field, Florida. I couldn't sit there in that tower looking straight at the gate and the American flag and then see black troops fall out on each side of that field and go off to segregated mess halls without understanding there's something wrong with this picture. So when I come to work at the Tennessean, I know where my head is. I have a sense of where the paper wants to go. Coleman Harwell, the editor, had put together a tremendous staff of people who went on to play other roles in journalism. David Halberstam was there. Tom Wicker, who later with the New York Times in Washington, was there. Wallace Westfeld, who produced Huntley Brinkley for NBC, was there. Dick Harwood, deputy managing editor later with the Washington Post, was there. Fred Graham, Supreme Court reporter later for CBS. We were all there because this editor wanted a staff that was going to be available to cover whatever the crisis, whenever it came. And more recently, I've received some memoranda that are demonstrate his vision as Brown approached.
How did your decade of experience at the Tennessean contribute to your later coverage of the Lawson workshops and the beginning of the sit-in movement in Nashville?
Well, I was a reporter who covered general assignment, and I was assigned to beats. I covered local government. I covered crime and the police. I covered the courts. I covered the legislature during that 10-year period. But that city, our city, and that newspaper were, I think, on a continuing basis aware of problems of color that existed in the community, the gap between where the society was and where the Constitution was and where the law was going. And I think back on that time, and all of us on that staff, young reporters, interacted constantly in conversation. I remember when the Emmett Till murder occurred in Money, Mississippi. Not only the decision by Mamie Till Mobley to open the coffin in Chicago and expose the brutality and outrage that had been done on a child. What a shock that was across the country. But then a white jury acquits these two men, and they accept money after their acquittal to confess to the story for a journalist. It was a story among stories, but the seminal story that woke up much of the country to the reality of lynched law and justice. It wasn't dead. It wasn't the past. It was here. It was now. This child was reality, shot, mangled, drowned with a weight around his neck. For no crime. and and the blatant arrogance of white superiority to just assume from the outset, yes, we can get away with this. We'll acquit them. And then their arrogance, we can get away with this, we'll tell it. We'll tell William Bradford Huey how we did it. It's one story among stories that were hitting the news pages every day involving race somewhere in the South.
So the front page news about the decision in Brown v. Board and the new path of constitutional law that John Lewis portrays in his book as producing immediate joy, also following the murder of Emmett Till, produces an immediate reaction that John Lewis talks about, that this is a stark reality we face.
Sure, and it comes in the context of Brown versus Board of Education coming down. The Supreme Court unanimously says Plessy is wrong, per se wrong, and suddenly you're thinking every politician in the South, with rare exceptions, is saying, don't care what the Supreme Court said, we're not going to go there. I mean, journalists read that stuff and react to it, from a story point of view. Where is this going to take us? We know conflict is ahead. We know problems ahead, challenges ahead. And if you were on that paper, whatever the development, political, another outrage, another lynching, another defiant reaction to school desegregation, as in Clinton, Tennessee, when Governor Clement rushed the National Guard to help protect those black children in Clinton going into that school. In the mind of the journalist who is not part of the actual coverage of the story, or maybe on the periphery of covering the story, it hits you where you live, because it's a story that at some point your paper is going to be challenged to cover.
You talk about the reality of the violence of Southern resistance, but you also mention the politics. And I'm very interested in your coverage of Little Rock. How did you see then, and how did you cover then the meetings between Governor Faubus and President Eisenhower, and what was the view of Cooper versus Aaron, the case that comes out of the integration of Central High School?
Well, you really have to think about the story of Little Rock Central High School in the national news context. Just in contrast to what Frank Clement had done in Tennessee, he sent the National Guard in to protect the African-American students who were entering that school. In Arkansas, Governor Faubus calls out the state National Guard to prevent black students from entering. And that was an act of defiance directed toward the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it was a national story. And so the result of it is every paper with any sense wants to be on the scene covering Little Rock. And I'd say, 50, 100 journalists at one time or another from different papers were in, or different radio and television stations were in and out of Little Rock. And we certainly were. The Little Rock newspaper headed editor was a man named Harry Ashmore. He made that newsroom a welcome place for all of us. And the great advantage of covering the story is not so much reacting to Faubus and Ike which is a national story and covered mostly out of Washington, it is interacting with other reporters and watching their reaction to the crass ugliness, the vulgarity of rabid, fanatical, angry, white adult men and women standing in the street. If they could have seen in the mirror the contortions on their faces, never would they have wanted their children to see them that way. And yet there they were.
And the constitutional issue is compelling, that you cannot let Southern governors facilitate that violence and then rely on the presence or threat of that violence as a way of delaying the implementation of Brown. Would it be fair to say that both Eisenhower and the court were backed into that issue in a way that they couldn't avoid?
I have always thought of Brown too, not immediately, but in retrospect, I've always thought about it, since I was able to put it in perspective, as a political decision, as a decision that permitted delay.
Given your personal history, experiences, and perspective, what's your personal recollection of Robert Kennedy's perspective as he assumes the responsibility from his brother of the campaign for civil rights or the issue of civil rights?
If I could just take it back one step to try to give it a little perspective. Robert Kennedy was his brother's campaign director. It was his consuming interest, almost an obsessive interest, to elect his brother president. He was consumed by the challenge. He saw his brother as one who could make a real difference in the society. And he understood, and his brother understood, and the campaign understood that North was North and South was South and race was race. Alabama goes for Kennedy. Georgia goes for Kennedy. Louisiana goes for Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy carries these 5 southern states, Texas with the help of Johnson, and Kennedy is well aware that it is Johnson who is giving him the help and support he needs in those southern states. There comes a time when Martin King is in jail, when Jack Kennedy makes the call to Coretta King to express his sympathy. All hell broke loose in the South. It was my assignment that morning to call the chairman of the southern states, and they were outraged, with one exception. Griffin Bell was chairman of the Georgia Democratic Party. His reaction was, it won't affect the outcome in Georgia. If you could give us a little advance notice on these things, it might help. But everyone else was outraged by that. And, looking back on it, it was a call of empathy. Nixon wouldn't make it, and it played a major role, I think, in helping John Kennedy influence some Southern African-American votes.
What was the discussion or thought about the experiences of the Eisenhower administration, and especially the Department of Justice under 2 attorneys general, who I know then and now you admire, Herbert Brownell and William Rogers?
Brownell and Rogers advised Ike, and I think pushed the administration toward desegregation. If you think of Tent City in Tennessee, Bill Rogers initiated those voting rights suits in West Tennessee, rural West Tennessee, Haywood and Fayette County. Landowners threw black sharecroppers ruthlessly off the land. That created a tent city. But Rogers had been the initiator of those lawsuits. Now, you look back on it and you can say, well, you know, it wasn't much. On the other hand, I was in the Kennedy administration, and if I'd been an African American, I well might have said of our administration, well, it wasn't much. It was significantly more than had been done during the Eisenhower administration. I mean, John Doerr, who was there during both administrations, has documented phenomenal increase, particularly in voting rights cases, which were relatively easy to win. They increased from something like 10 to 100. It was quite clear to Robert Kennedy when he thought about becoming Attorney General of the United States that he did not want to ever be in a position where Bill Rogers was. And I think in some ways during that campaign, it was quite clear that race was a factor in decision-making regarding the South. Robert Kennedy goes into that office knowing that if there is a Central High School, he will be like Bill Rogers. If there is an explosion, he will be anathema in the South. And times have changed, but not that much. And so from the first day, he and the president are thinking strategically, you know, if there's any way we can keep this movement in the courts and out of the streets, we can win voting rights cases and expeditiously. But civil rights violence cases, we're going to have a very tough time because most of them are considered state offenses, and J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, maintained in the Eisenhower administration and in the early days of the Kennedy administration that murder, arson, assault were state crimes and not federal civil rights violations.
Now, let's pursue that point. This actually begins to define the first meeting between the Attorney General and Dr. King.
It was Dr. King's first visit to Washington since the inaugural. It's April, and he's having an SCLC board meeting at the Mayflower Hotel. Burke Marshall and I were invited to drop by that meeting, pay our respects, and we did. And then Martin King was coming to the office after lunch for a meeting with the Attorney General one-on-one, and then would go to the White House and meet with Harris Wofford. The president was out of town. It was I was the note taker for the meeting. The three of us were there, the Attorney General behind his desk, and Dr. King just across from him. I was to the Attorney General's left and Martin's right. And Bob began the conversation after warm and affectionate remarks, appreciation for the election and the way the campaign had been run, and expressed appreciation for the call Dr. King that Jack Kennedy had made to Coretta, and it was quite friendly, and remained quite friendly throughout. And Bob had this case that he had to make. He said, you know, I'm in a position where I am able to expeditiously win cases of voting rights. He explained that the director of the FBI was not sympathetic to the idea that he had jurisdiction over civil rights violations, that J. Edgar Hoover felt there were ambiguities in the law that barred him from enforcing assaults, arsons, beatings, murders. Those were state crimes, and state local officials would have to prosecute them. Voting rights, on the other hand, was a federal offense, and Kennedy made the case with King that if you could focus the thrust of the movement on voting rights, it will change the character of the South. At one point, Jim Eastland was the racist senator from Mississippi. At one point, Bob said to Martin, Jim Eastland won't be so fresh if he has to face a mountain of black votes in Mississippi. And he explained how many cases he had already directed Burke Marshall and John Doerr in the Civil Rights Division to initiate. And I thought he made as strong a case, as powerful a case as he could. On the other hand, if you look across the desk, Martin's expression was inscrutable. But you know that the wheels are turning, and he is aware that he is talking to a master politician to whom votes mean something. He knows that in the back of Kennedy's mind and the back of the president's mind are those 5 states. He certainly understood that a strategy that kept the movement away from the violence like Little Rock, or kept us away from a federal-state confrontation. He understood that would benefit the administration.
And frankly, later, the NAACP, Mr. Marshall himself, prefers the strategy of the courtroom to the strategy of confronting Southern violence and then having to go to court to defend the movement's objectives.
If you listen to the tapes between Lyndon Johnson and Martin, after Johnson is president and is pushing for civil rights, he suggests to Dr. Martin Luther King that he lobby Congress. And he tells them, we need votes. I was reminded when I heard Lyndon's voice speaking to Dr. King about how he was going to change the Senate and change the Congress. He speaks directly to the need for votes. I was reminded about how Martin must have reacted, how I know he did react, and how he reacted. I've said in the past, Bob, that I thought Kennedy that day was the ultimate pragmatist, interested in his brother's cause and his brother's ongoing campaign, which had to last through 4 years. And he proposed a rational and reasonable political alternative to bring about change in the South. Dr. King was the ultimate idealist that day, and I think in every day of his life. And he said, and they were on a first-name basis by the time the meeting was over. And he said, you know, I understand what you're saying about the FBI, and I understand the thrust of what you're saying, and I want you to know that we have something called the Voter Education Project in Atlanta that is doing exactly what you suggest. A man named Wiley Branton heads it, and we will pursue it. But
So he doesn't disagree.
no, he doesn't disagree with it.
Including not disagreeing at all with the legal strategy of pursuing voting.
He doesn't
cases.
embrace that, but he says clearly he understands the importance of votes, and he understands the attitude of the FBI. But he said, as for me, I must go where I find the evil of racism afflicts the South. And
I've never asked you this before when you say that, but I sometimes wonder in my mind if he's recalling Montgomery when he was asked whether a direct action campaign in the form of a bus boycott would be wrong, and he answered quite spontaneously to the thousands assembled in that church that night, if we're wrong, the Supreme Court of the United States is wrong. If we're wrong, the Constitution is wrong.
I think by that time it had become ingrained in his psyche. It was part of how he felt, how he was, and it was part of him. And he said, I must go where the evil exists, and sometimes where it is, its presence is palpable, and I must confront it. And then he said, and I must do it in a way, and I'm paraphrasing here, both of them, but the thrust of it is true to what was said. And he said, but I must dramatize the evil, which said to Bob what Bob did not want to hear. I'm going to conduct these demonstrations, and the media is going to cover them. And yes, we're going to be at risk. And he said, I know you don't have a national police force. Help us when you can, however you can, as much as you can. I understand the shortcomings that exist. So it was a friendly meeting, but I think when he left, I took him down to put him in the car to take him over to the White House. I think Bob thought, well, the South's going to be a problem. He knew that the days were going to be difficult. Now, he could not have known that just about 2 months to the day, a little less than that, almost 2 months to the day, that the Nashville Freedom Riders would get caught in a trap in Montgomery, Alabama, and that a second Freedom Rider explosion would occur, and that there would be a wave of national publicity about a confrontation between federal government and the state of Alabama, not unlike the confrontation that confronted the Eisenhower administration in the state of Arkansas, Central High School.
John, I want to take you back to your mention of John Doerr and ask you to reflect on Burke Marshall and John Doerr and this early leadership of the Justice Department that was so important.
Well, the Attorney General becomes Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the land in January 1961. In the process of what amounted to his Justice Department cabinet, he relied heavily on Byron White, his Deputy Attorney General, who was a distinguished lawyer, leader in the American Bar Association. So he relied heavily on Byron White, and Byron White relied heavily on his knowledge of distinguished lawyers who had expertise in specific areas. And Burke Marshall was Byron White's choice to be Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. It turned out he had a keen mind, a mind like a steel trap. He was creative, innovative, and totally committed to the cause. Dorr had been second in the Civil Rights Division under Bill Rogers, under the Eisenhower administration, and Burke immediately told Bob, "I need him. They've done good work in voter registration cases, and I need him." And in their first meeting, that's when Bob set up by 10 times the number of voting rights cases you now have. He had said to the Attorney General, Bobby, we just don't have the people. And he said, "Hire the people, Burke." And so, I mean, Burke was the right choice. He was indefatigable. He was judicious. He was sort of apolitical, but he was totally committed and totally involved. And I think very early on earned the respect of Thurgood Marshall and Louis Martin, who was an African-American leader, political leader, on whom the president had relied. And so Burke came to the job with no background or experience in civil rights, but a total commitment. He had been a brilliant lawyer, and before that a brilliant law student, and after the death of President Kennedy would go on to be a distinguished faculty member at Yale.
John, were there early discussions before you were actually sent south and became personally involved in that Southern violence?
The movement went where, as Martin said, he was going to go, where the evil existed, where the corruption was present, where racism was palpable. And they confronted it in a whole variety of ways of public accommodations, housing, education. I mean, wherever it was, that's where they went. And of course, if you were in the movement, and that's where you were, and that's where danger was, that's where you wanted the government. So there was a disconnect between the strategy he was going to pursue and the expectations that were inevitably going to exist.
Now, John, the story of your role in the Kennedy Justice Department, including a personal experience with Southern violence at its peak, really has two parts. The first occasion is your rescue of the earliest Freedom Riders after, I believe, they were beaten in Birmingham, and how you got these young people to New Orleans. And then the occasion of your returning to Montgomery, and what you said earlier was the sense of the administration that they may yet see another Little Rock.
The violence came at Anniston, Alabama, and Birmingham on a Sunday afternoon. There's a roadblock. The Klan bombs the bus, mauls, beats, blasts the Freedom Riders on that bus. And the result of it is they're not physically able to continue. They then vote to go by air to New Orleans, put the ride behind them, and they can't get out of Birmingham because there are bomb threats by levied at Delta Airlines. And so I was flown down by the administration, met with Delta, relatively easy to make the arrangements to make sure there were no bombs on the airplane, and we flew down quickly that afternoon, got into New Orleans that night, and delivered them to waiting friends who took care of them. I go to a motel and go to sleep, wake up early in the morning, the Attorney General says, he opens the conversation by saying, "Who the hell is Diane Nash?" And Diane Nash was the beautiful young Fisk student who was directing the Nashville Freedom Rides. And I wind up in a conversation with her in which I explained to her that if she sends this group of young people, I didn't know it at the outset, but they were already on the way. If you send them down here, you're sending them to their deaths. As she said, we simply are not going to let violence overcome nonviolence. And it was that simple.
Now, John, you've talked before about Montgomery. This really takes your experience with Southern violence to a new level. Can you describe it both from the perspective of how it impacted you to be there, and also what it did to the significance of your role in communicating with the Attorney General and even the President?
Once the Nashville riders got to Montgomery, and I tried to convince Diane not to send them. She was, as I've said, like the tree by the water. She was not going to be moved. She told me with chilling clarity, yes, we know someone may die. We've made out our wills. I lost that discussion with her, reported to the Attorney General what she said, and then headed from New Orleans back to Montgomery to try to be there when they arrived, where they were in jail. It's mind-boggling to think about how so many of them adopted that mindset. It reminds you just how corrupt the system of justice was. At the Attorney General's direction, and after working out a strategy to try to get the governor of Alabama, John Patterson, to provide police protection for these Freedom Riders who are going to continue the ride from Birmingham on to New Orleans. They're going to continue the ride that had been interrupted by the first wave of violence at Anniston and Birmingham. Now, I'm pleading with the governor, arguing with the governor, asserting to the governor that the state of Alabama should, could, must provide protection. It was a heated exchange at times, more heat on his part than on mine. I was trying to convince him that this should not be Alabama's problem, that this should be a problem from Mississippi when the Freedom Riders arrived there, or Louisiana when they arrived in New Orleans. And finally, his state police commissioner said to him, "Governor, if you tell me to protect them, I will protect them." That didn't make the governor necessarily happy, but he did come to an agreement that the Freedom Riders would be protected. And so next morning, they arrived at the Greyhound station. I was there with my friend John Doerr, who had business in Judge Frank Johnson's court that morning, and he was going to ride by car down to Montgomery. So the Freedom Riders board the bus in Birmingham at the station. We drive down by car. By the time I get to the Justice Department building, where Judge Frank Johnson's court was, to let John Doerr out, the bus had already arrived across the alley at the Greyhound bus terminal. And above a shed, I could see baggage being hurled into the air. John Doerr ran for the federal building to tell the Attorney General. I began to drive up. And this mob of hundreds of people had exploded onto this parking lot, and it was an anthill of violence, shouts, screams of anger, of pain. The Freedom Riders were being pummeled. I gradually circled the block, not knowing, because there was so much turmoil, I couldn't see quite clearly, except that it was a mass of violence, massive assaults. The young women on the bus, two of them white, the two, Susan Wilbur and Susan Herman, came off the bus. They reached the taxi cabs, a black taxi driver who refuses to take the two white women and says, naturally, I'll be arrested. I'm not allowed to transport white women. And one of the brave young women, Freedom Riders, Catherine Burks, who was black, said, move over, I'll drive the cab, but he would not. And so the two young women wandered off as the cab left. As I came down, they were being attacked. And I thought I could get them in the car, get them out of there, and rescue them. And I tried. Susan Herman, I shouted to her to get in the back seat. Some of the satellite mob that was attacking them was between Susan Wilbur and me, but I finally reached her, grabbed her by the arm, pulled her around the front of the car. She resisted getting in the car, said she was prepared for the violence, and that she was a nonviolent person and she didn't want me to get hurt. And then when I turned around to the surging crowd that was moving in on us and said, get back, magic words, I'm from the federal government. I turned back to her and got hit with a pipe over the head. And I was knocked unconscious. First time in my life I've ever been knocked unconscious. I don't remember a thing for what they tell me was 30 minutes. Woke up, finally a police officer had come, taken me out from under the car, put me in the front seat. He later got me to the hospital.
What's the end of this chapter of your time in the Department of Justice?
Well, the whole story, Bob, in the final analysis, has to be the story of the courage and determination. That's where it begins, and that's where it ends. They never faltered, never failed, never once blinked in the face of danger and death. You know you are not changing the hearts and minds of people in Jackson, Mississippi. If anything, you're making them more angry, and maybe for the first time, you're making them afraid that they won't be able to sustain, quote, the old ways. It doesn't restrain anybody. I mean, the Klan is the Klan, and Klan violence is Klan violence. The movement has finally pushed the ultimate dilemma on the country and on the administration. There is something about the nature of our society that has a dark side, and it has been with us from the very beginning. It is a side that moves us against justice. It encourages discrimination against people who are minorities, who are not, quote, like us. It's what gave us slavery. It's what gave religious groups violent persecution. It's what kept women from the ballot box for 145 years after the American Revolution. There's a dark side to our culture, and it's only when you're able to look at the success of the movement that you understand that the ultimate answer is a people under law. It really takes a commitment of people who understand justice and who seek justice and who are willing to fight for justice in order to make the law work at times when that dark side of our nature emerges and threatens to bring us down.